So nerfs to Eradicators, buffs to many underperforming units, and some big changes to the way that missions are played in Warhammer 40k. Games Workshop have just given us a crazy ton of changes to the game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about the ton of FAQs that Games Workshop just released. And these are no mere clarifications or explaining away obscure rules, these are actual changes to 40k. They changed points, they changed the way that some of the secondaries are worded, and they've nerfed away a broken combo or two. There's been an absolute ton to unpack, so in this video we're going to go through a brief overview of each of the changes, and we might take a few follow-up videos to look at certain factions such as Imperial Guard and Death Guard. So here's the rough overview of all the changes that have happened in this update. There's a whole load of new FAQ documents that have been updated. I'll put the link down to the main Warhammer community article down in the video description. Firstly, there's some changes to the big rulebook. Certain mission objectives have changed, both the primaries and the secondary objectives, and a lot more rare rules have been added or clarified to cover some certain niche interactions in a bit more of a general way. A lot of factions throughout the game see points rebalanced, both up and down. For the most part, they tend to have been quite light touch on these. Some factions are entirely unchanged. Some see just 2 or 3 units tweaked, where some factions such as Drukhari have seen changes pretty much across the board. There have been a couple of rules changes to the factions, in particular one regarding the Space Marine Apothecary, and they've also reissued the documents for points, so you can download all the points of the current units in the game directly from Games Workshop, which is quite nice, and also all the power levels as well. For the Psychic Awakening books, they've made a lot of the unique options accessible in Crusade, things like Plague Companies for Death Guard and various other bits. There's a brand new FAQ for Codex Blood Angels, which didn't have one before, and we'll go over that in another video. And there's all the points for the new Codex of Death Guard, again which I'm planning on making another video for when I get chance. Those are the main changes, but they have scattered in a few more FAQs and erratas to clear up some rules issues within the codexes. Mostly minor stuff, but a couple change the way that you might play a unit. Notably, what isn't here is 2-wound Chaos Marines or Grey Knights. That update will likely come with their codex, or changes to the other war gear that we might have expected in that initial war gear FAQ. Things like Orc Burners and Scorchers are still 8-inch range rather than 12 inches, and Tower Fusion Blasters still don't get the melter change. Both of those will most likely be coming with the codexes. So let's talk about some of the points changes for the Space Marines and Necrons, then go through some of the core rulebook changes, and then go on to the rest of the Imperium, Chaos and Xenos. Possibly the headline news is that Eradicators have gone up. They're plus 5 points to 45 points, a small nerf, but I think it takes them from being a ludicrously undercosted unit to one that's just decently strong. Your standard unit will go from 120 points to 135 points, and I think they genuinely will see less play because of that. You might be choosing other things such as attack bikes, and units like Devastators look a lot more palatable as well. Inceptors and Outriders have also both gone up 5 points. The Plasma Inceptors are the main reason that they went up, I think. They were very, very strong and run by a lot of players. Again, it's a small but noticeable nerf, you'll see less of them played. And then finally, Outriders went up from 45 to 50. For Outriders, I'm really not sure that they really needed to go up, to be honest. Sure, they were a decent strong unit, but I would peg them a fair bit below Eradicators and Inceptors. They just didn't have the same amount of crazy value. Finally, in a change that mirrored across quite a lot of codexes, Servitors have gone up to 30 points for a unit, really meaning that if you're playing Space Marines, then fielding any chaff whatsoever is going to be quite expensive. Though honestly, if you're paying 30 points for just a unit to do an action, they still might genuinely have their uses in competitive play, rather than making one of your 100-point units of Marines stand around and do nothing for a turn. In terms of other Space Marine units, possibly some of the best that have survived without a change are the Blade Guard and the Vanguard Veterans. These guys have both been played a lot, and I think they'll continue to be played a lot now some of the other most efficient Space Marine units have taken a slight nerf. The Apothecary remains very, very strong, but the most excessive thing it can do has now been reined in. You can now no longer use that combat revival stratagem to resurrect an entire 8-wound invader ATV, which was honestly a little bit broken in my mind. Although to be honest, it still doesn't change the Apothecary from being a really, really strong unit. You can still bring things like Centurions or attack bikes straight back from the dead, so despite one combo having died, I think Apothecaries are still going to be played a lot in Space Marine lists. Finally, in one of the FAQs for Codex Space Marines, they've clarified their combat doctrine abilities. There's some abilities that allow certain units to get their combat doctrine earlier in the game than the actual doctrine is. There's a stratagem in the core Codex Space Marines that allows them to use another doctrine. They have clarified that if you do use this, you also get an advantage of your super doctrine if you happen to have one. Really good news for chapters with powerful super doctrines, particularly armies such as Blood Angels, Space Wolves and White Scars will very much like having their own unique combat doctrine early in the game if you pay some command points. So largely a nerf for Codex Space Marines, with one small buff thrown in. If we delve into the unique chapters, there are a couple of really interesting changes indeed. I recently went over the Black Templars and saying why the Crusader squad was really quite such a bad choice at the moment, but Games Workshop have decided to flip that on its head. Now Crusader squad Marines are 15 points per model for an initiate, meaning that you're going to be getting a very heavily discounted force of angry Space Marines charging across the board. They're just very tough point for point now, and they're still going to put a decent hurt on anything that they catch up with. With that big points drop, they're now a very solid unit for Black Templars, and I expect to see them played quite a lot. The Emperor's Champion also dropped a few points, going down to 80 from 85, and he's an even better choice than before, and Cenobite Servitors went down a little bit as well. Otherwise, Iron Father Phyros went up to 160 points. His buffing aura is very good, but that's getting very expensive now for a 5+ invul. Finally, the Dark Angels had a few changes. They now have a new unit called a Deathwing Strike Master, who will presumably be featuring in the new codex, and they might well have accidentally let slip a new mechanic for Dark Angels that's coming out in the new codex. There's a points table called Rites of Initiation, which allows you to pay certain points to upgrade certain vehicles and characters for different points based on exactly what you choose. All of the units are either dreadnoughts, transports that can carry terminators, or captains and lieutenants, and I believe that this is an upgrade to essentially induct them into the inner circle and make them Deathwing. We don't know exactly what form that buff will get, but if it's only being able to be wounded on a 4+, much like Deathwing Terminators, it could be very powerful indeed. We'll have to wait for the new Dark Angels Codex when it comes out. Next up we move on to the Necrons, the other units that they showed off in the article. Just a few changes for these guys. The Canoptic Reanimator has gone down a massive 30 points to 90 points, making it from an absolute garbage unit to perhaps something that could be situationally useful, though I would still be worried about it being quite so fragile. Perhaps could be worth it, but only if you can shield it from enemy fire. Arguably the strongest unit in the codex, the Catan Shard of the Nightbringer, has gone up from 350 points to 370, making him maybe a slight bit more of a choice as to whether or not you take him, though in reality it's well less than a 10% points increase. I think he's still very usable, and is still going to be a nightmare for your opponent to deal with. Otherwise, pretty much no changes for the Necrons. I was wondering whether they might give that hex mark a bit of a lift, but it seems that they have chosen not to for now. We'll get back to the rest of the points changes in a bit, but first let's go over some of the most important changes, the changes to the missions and the core rules of 40k. First up, first turn will now always go to the person who rolled higher. They don't get to choose. It is literally a 50-50 chance whether you go first or second. They've essentially done this to try and remove one decision about trying to second guess your opponent apparently, and I guess now when you're deploying, you can just be happy that you do have an even chance of going first or second. As we all know, 40k has had a bit of a first turn advantage, but they've actually made a major swing to try and fix this by their changing of the primary objectives. Usually primary objectives are scored in the player's command phase, and previously for the player going second, it generally meant that their turn 5 was kind of entirely wasted. Sure, you might be able to get onto objectives, but you couldn't score them because you wouldn't have another command phase. Now on turn 5, the player scores their objectives at the end of the turn, not the start, giving them a unique advantage to basically jump onto a whole load of objectives and try and wrest them away from the player who went first. If they can outlast their opponent and then move forward with a bunch of fast units with Auspex, they could potentially get a really big swing, maybe getting 15 points of the primaries in the last turn. You still need to make sure that your army goes the distance, but if you have more or less equal forces and a fairly even grasp on the board, this should really help to counteract the first turn advantage and make the game a bit more balanced whether you're going first or second. I really quite like the way that it actually makes player 2's turn 5 have more of a point now. In some matchups it might be entirely redundant anything that you actually do on turn 5, only what you manage to score in the command phase. I like this, I think it's a really good change, so thank you for Games Workshop for making the missions that bit better. The other big shake-up is that a few secondaries have been changed. Bring It Down and Abhor the Witch have both been nerfed, and While We Stand We Fight is now a bit different. Bring It Down was just really punishing for any armies that brought a ton of vehicles. If you brought 5 or more tanks or monsters, you'd have a very good chance of your opponent maxing this without too much effort, but basically vehicles tend to give 1 less point than they did previously now. You now only get 1 point for killing enemy vehicles that are less than 11 wounds, 2 points for anything that's 11 to 19, and 3 points for 20 or more. It's really nice for smaller vehicles such as Penitent Engines, various transports with 10 wounds, and Harlequin and Drakari skimmers. This objective is now going to be nowhere near as punishing. I think this will actually make a big change to list construction, and we'll see a lot more vehicles on the table. Abhor the Witch has also been toned down. It's no longer so brutal against Grey Knight and Thousand Suns armies, though it might still be the one that you want to try and take against them. You now only get 3 points for each psychic character that you kill, and 2 points for other psychic units that aren't characters. Still a pretty decent chance to max it against Grey Knights or Thousand Suns if you do manage to rack up the kills of most of their army, but it might not be quite as much an auto pick against armies such as demons now. Finally, while we stand we fight now means that you have to try and defend your 3 most expensive units and not models. I think this prevents people from trying to do slightly gamey things by having their most expensive models being characters that you can't target and trying to max this quite easily. And it does mean that your opponent might be able to get to grips with your most expensive units just that little bit easier. Still though, this could still be a good choice. If you have an army that's got 3 just enormous units that are going to be almost impossible to kill, this still might be a very, very good choice, maybe for armies such as Custodes or Death Guard with big units of Terminators perhaps. Finally, they've made one small change to psychic actions. They can now be denied by anything that affects psychic powers, such as that Citizens of Battle stratagem that ignores a psychic power on the roll of a 4+. Not a major change, but I think it's kind of trying to write them out of a rules corner that they wrote themselves into by for some reason making them completely different to psychic powers and having their own mechanics. Overall though, I really like these changes to the missions. I feel positive about every single one, and it's going to be interesting to try and get to grips with the new objectives. Looking forward to trying out a few more vehicles in my army. Perhaps the only major thing that I might have liked to see was some sort of secondary that targets elite units, as I still feel that that's a bit of a gap. Next up, we have the other changes to the core rulebook, and most of these are fairly minor things that clarify niche circumstances. Strategic reserves can always set up in their own deployment zone, even if other units' rules might have gotten in the way previously, such as infiltrators. So that could be an interesting way to try and get some models inside the infiltrator's deep strike denial aura if you really, really need to. Very niche though, I think. There's actually been quite a few changes to transport vehicles. There's some clarifications on big models getting out of them and basically allowing them to, even though they wouldn't be able to set up within 3 inches if their base size is an issue. They state that effects applied to the transport are applied to the unit within it, so if the transport is -1 to hit, then the unit inside will be 2 if they shoot out of it. You can't use any special rules to count as if stationary to disembark after moving a transport. That's still just a special trick limited to just a few transports, and they've doubly clarified that moving out of phase actions can still let you embark, such as Eldar units using Fire and Fade, which can allow Dark Reapers to jump out, shoot some enemies, and then get back in their transport should they really want to. Next, they've clarified a rule about deep strike charges that they hadn't made entirely obvious, but I did make a video about previously. If you're charging units in middle floor ruins, you can technically get an 8-inch charge out of deep strike due to the way that triangles work, because in this handy diagram, they can deploy 9 inches away on distance 2, but only be 8 inches away on distance 4, allowing them to get into engagement range, because engagement range has a 5-inch vertical height as well. Doesn't really make sense, to be honest. I would have imagined that middle floor ruins units would be harder to charge, not easier, but I guess it's the way that the game mechanics have shaken out. Finally, they've clarified always fight last abilities means that you now can't use the counter-offensive stratagem to interrupt. Say, if you have a Judicia make a unit fight last, that unit can't break out of sequence with counter-offensive, which I think might have been rules as written already, but they have doubly underlined it, so there's now no way of getting out of it. It's very clear. To be honest, most of this was minor stuff, but good to iron out any wrinkles in the game that have become apparent, so at least there's an official answer. Now throughout all the different codexes there are an absolute ton of points changes, and I haven't been able to go through them all. I've picked out a few of the biggest highlights for Imperium, Chaos and Xenos, so we'll just go through those, which are some of the biggest changes that I think might actually affect the way that armies are played. First of all, and I'd say quite helpfully, all units have now got this 9th edition style points cost section, where you don't have to flip back and forth between several different pages now, you literally have the unit's entry and then their war gear below that. Really helpful for army construction, and I think that that's definitely a boon for most units. Next, we did mention that Death Guard have got their own points values, and I'll try and cover those in a new video, seeing as they're going to be reflective of the points cost and the rules changes in their new codex, and there's an absolute ton of changes, so I think it does warrant it. Getting into the rest of the Imperium though, the Custodes Virtus Praetors have dropped from 95 points to 85. I think they were already competitively viable in some Custodes lists, and now they're certainly more so. And if you do want to hold down some objectives, Storm Shield Custodian Guard are cheaper than before, now 52 points, and are going to keep those objectives on lockdown. For the Sisters, there have been some slight nerfs to Repentia, who are now up at 16 points per model, but in my opinion still very efficient, maybe a little bit less of an auto take than previously. And Retributors have gone up 2 points a model, now they're going to be 14 points each before war gear. Again, makes the fearsome firepower of the multi-melter Retributor squad just a little bit less of an auto take compared with other options. One change that I quite liked are that Zephyrim have dropped 2 points, they're now 18 points, and in combination with their power swords going up to strength 4 in the last update, I think that they're a very interesting unit now. They reroll charges on the drop, and with their flexible deep strikes, I think we're going to see more of them played. For Imperial and Chaos Knights, Armigers now seem to be where it's at. The Warglaive with the Melter is now 135 points, and the Helverin is 155. These are now really efficient little units point for point, and I could easily see them making appearances in more lists. I think most Knight lists are now certainly going to run some, and they might even be worth allying in as a super heavy auxiliary or even a full super heavy detachment if you really wanted to go absolutely crazy with Warglaives. If you did go absolutely nuts, you could take 3 units of 3 within a super heavy detachment. That would cost you just over 1200 points, but that would get you 108 wounds of vehicles on the table with some excellent anti-tank firepower and some melee that'll deal with near enough anything. I honestly suspect that armies will be making some good appearances in competitive lists. For the Imperial Guard, they've got some slightly weird changes. For some reason, infantry squads and veteran squads have gone up 5 points per model, strangely making your average guardsman now cost 5.5 points. I'm honestly not really sure that was necessary. People aren't exactly spamming entire armies of Imperial Guard, though point for the stats, their infantry squads are still fairly solid. Guard are still going to need infantry one way or the other, but we might see a few less of them now. The tanks have been a little bit rebalanced. Leman Russes themselves have gone down 5 points, whereas tank commanders have gone up 5, maybe redressing the balance between the two. Tank commanders now still have the damage output advantage, but point for point are really quite fragile for the amount of points in just one tank, where your standard Russ is the slightly less snazzy but more durable option. Astropaths have gone up 10 points, I'm afraid. They're now 35, and to be honest, that might have swung them back to being Primaris Psychers as the one to go for. Having access to Smite is quite nice after all, though having the extra discount for cheap guard powers is no bad thing either. They're quite well balanced, I think. Finally though, guards did get 2 very big buffs. First of all, Bulgrins with Moors got massively cheaper. They're now 35 points from 43, which I'm honestly a bit perplexed as they were already one of the most efficient units in the Guard Codex. These guys are now excellent bullies, being able to slog their way to the centre of the board, and they're just very, very efficient. Few enemy guns will have good effect against them, and I expect to see several more plays. Finally, the already decent Chimera seems to have dropped 10 points. They're now 80 points base with a heavy bolter and multi-laser, and honestly, in combination with that change to bring it down, they're more viable than ever. If you're fielding infantry squads in Chimeras, they've now gained 5 points essentially. Moving on to the forces of Chaos. Chaos Marines have seen a couple of changes in the fast attack section, with Raptors kind of mirroring Black Templars, and they've now dropped to 15 points per model, when previously they were 18. They still have 1 wound unlike their Loyalist counterparts, but that's really not bad for a deep strike unit with a reasonable amount of damage output. Warp Talons have also seen a similar drop, going down to 23 from 27, and they're quite an interesting unit, being able to benefit from a few of the synergies, being part demon. Otherwise, a fair bit of war gear has been tweaked, some of the variants of Terminators are cheaper, and Thunderhammers are a bit cheaper on characters, in line with Codex Space Marines. For the demons, there have been some helpful changes to Blood Crushers and Plague Drones. Both have dropped 5 points to 40 and 35 respectively. Particularly Plague Drones might be even more interesting now. A fast, tough Nurgle unit that can get where it wants to and deal a reasonable amount of damage is pretty good. The slightly underwhelming Soul Grinder has gone down to 170 from 185, which is no bad thing, though I'm not sure it's exactly competitive yet. But there has been one nerf, which are to the omnipresent Nurgle swarms in pretty much any second Chaos list. They've now gone up from 18 points to 22 points per model. Though for the amount of durability and their excellent screening abilities, I still suspect that they will be a staple in several lists. That's holding the midfield and being annoying and tying up enemy units really is worth its weight in gold. The Nurglings also did pick up an FAQ. Mortal wounds are now not considered to be damage 1 weapons, so they don't get their feel no pain against them. To be honest, I believe that was the way it works rules as written anyway, but Games Workshop has clarified that. The Chaos Knight changes mirror the Imperial ones, and to be honest they could be quite a lot more relevant on them with War Dogs. 135 point Melter and Chain Cleaver War Dogs can get +1 attack on the charge and extra AP as well, with their Iconoclast households, and to be honest, a massive amount of these could be incredibly intimidating. Finally, Thousand Sons don't appear to have been affected by too many changes, though they will benefit from that Abhor the Witch change. To be honest, the Thousand Sons just are really looking forward to getting a new codex. Last but not least, we come to Xenos, and Tau, to be honest, have had a bit of a side grade. Not really exactly what they needed, seeing as they're one of the factions in the game that's struggling the most. On the plus side, Shadow Sun has gained the Supreme Commander keyword, meaning she's very easy to include in lists, command point free now. Crisis Suits got 5 points cheaper, and broadsides went down quite a bit, such as dropping 15 points on the version with all the missiles. Unfortunately, a couple of the variants of their commanders have gone up, 5 points more, and if you want to field extra drones, tactical drones are now really expensive for some reason. They cost 20 points a model, and I don't think people are going to use them. Things are a lot more reasonable for attached drones, as they were before. I don't believe that their points cost have changed, but for some reason if you field them in your own drone unit, then they cost a lot. The side grade isn't really going to be enough to turn their fortunes around. Moving on to the pointy ears, Craftworld's troops have dropped a little bit. Guardians are now 8 points and Dire Avengers are 11 points. Could be good for unleashing some Guardian bombs on the enemy, and Drukhari have seen some of the most drastic points changes out of any of the factions, and to be honest I'm not quite as familiar with as many of their units. All of their troops seem to have gone down in points, in particular Rax dropped by a lot, they're now only 8 points base, making them pretty excellent objective holders. Their Beastmaster units seem to have gone down as well, although several of their characters cost a little more, including Drazar. For these changes, they could be trying to reflect the new unit stats and options that they'll get in their new codex, which we do know is coming out at least fairly soon. But in the meantime, I think it's largely good news for the army. Harlequins might be some of the biggest winners out of this whole FAQ. In terms of points changes, their Void Weaver got very slightly cheaper, and they didn't get any significant nerfs to their army. At least in competitive play, they're one of the strongest armies in the game right now, and the fact that Space Marines have received some hefty nerfs means they really might be able to cement their hold on the top spot. For Orcs, the back and forth of the custom force field Big Mech now goes down to 60 points again, which I believe is probably a typo. Games Workshop seems to have been quite confused about this guy ever since he came out in Saga of the Beast. In the meantime, he's pretty much an auto-include for the Orc list once more. Finally, Tyranids and Genestealer Cult have seen a fair few changes. In particular, Warriors and Hiveguard have dropped decently for the Nids. Hiveguard were already pretty great in particular, and dropping from 40 points to 35 is only going to get them seen playing more. The Tyrannifex has gone down a bit as well. Those zone troops seem to have gone up a bit, they've gone from 45 to 50 points. Finally, for Genestealer Cults, one of the factions that I think is struggling to see too much play right now, the Goliath Rock Grinder has gone down fairly decently. You can now get its variants for 95 points, and Aberrants went down in cost a little bit as well, which is good as I did think they were a bit overcosted compared with the standard troops. So overall, an absolutely massive amount of changes to the game, and it's going to take a while for all of these to take effect. On the whole, I think the Games Workshop has done a pretty good job with this. I like the Space Marine changes, I like the Necron changes, and I like the mission changes. I'd say most of the points changes that they have made tend to be better more than worse, with a few weird exceptions such as Bullrun going down for no good reason, or Tau tactical drones being nerfed into the floor. I'm sure there's a whole ton of things that I've missed throughout all of these FAQs, and I'm sure you know your own army better than I do, so if you have any further insights, please let me know down in the comments. As soon as I can, I will be looking to get a few more videos out, so hopefully expect a little bit to follow in terms of Blood Angels, Death Guard and Imperial Guard over the next few days. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. We'll certainly be continuing to keep on top of the changes for Warhammer 40k as they come out, and particularly looking forward to covering the Death Guard and Dark Angels codexes when they're out. Finally, if you have been enjoying these videos and finding them useful, I would just like to mention that the channel has a Patreon page which you can find down in the video description. Channel patrons get certain advantages, such as seeing certain new videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry to the prize giveaways which we hold every month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support the channel, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.